Well, good morning, all of you amazing KWMR listeners. I have a wonderful guest this morning, actually a local individual by the name of Ken Dickinson. He is a longtime resident of Marin County and for 10 years ran a monthly open mic poetry night in downtown San Rafael called West End Wednesdays. Born in Yorkshire, England, Ken arrived in the Bay Area in 1981 and has always had an interest in photography and poetry. He's on the phone with us this morning. He's going to share some of his writing talent and also to tell us about a very special event. Good morning, Ken. Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh,
yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right. Ken, did you grow up in a literary family?
Not really. Although, my mom, before she became a homemaker, which was the tradition, back when I grew up, that mom stayed at home and raised the kids, she was a librarian. And so I remember every Saturday as a kid, she'd haul us all off there were 3 kids at that time. Later, my younger brother arrived, but she'd haul us off to the library, and we'd always come home with a bag full of books. So we were encouraged to read, but nobody was sitting around the table discussing literature and poetry and things like that.
Did you enjoy reading as a child?
I loved it because I grew up in a world without television. We didn't really get I remember getting our first television set when I was about 9 or 10 years old. So you just had the radio and books, so it really was a world of the imagination. And I remember my dad was an electrician, and he built these bed warmers because we lived out in the countryside in an old Victorian stone house that was very damp and cold. And he built these bed warmers. There was an electric light bulb in a frame that you'd put in the bed at night, and it would warm the bed up. And I can remember going to bed and leaving the bed warmer on so I could read at night. I mean, I would read a long time, all these great adventure books for kids and comic books and things like that.
Did you have a favorite?
Well, my 2 favorite books were The Famous Five and I think it was The Adventurous Seven, and it was about this group of kids that were always going off on adventures. The Famous Five was absolutely my favorite series of books.
Interesting. And, you brought up a good point, Ken. Do you think that back in the day when there was not any television, there was just the radio, that it produced a whole different generation of individuals as a result that were probably more well-read, which would be a logical conclusion?
Yes, I think there's something to that. Our Google of that time was the encyclopedia. I think just about every home had a set of encyclopedias in the house.
Yes.
And that was our Google. If you wanted to know anything about anything, and you asked somebody and they didn't know, you'd go and look in the encyclopedia. And we never had the Encyclopedia Britannica, which was the top-level encyclopedia. We had some lesser quality version that was probably cheaper, I think ours was even a hand-me-down. Somebody gave us their older encyclopedia when they got a better one. But I can remember on the school holidays and the weekends spending hours in those books, just thumbing through different subjects and getting completely absorbed in the content.
And you mentioned your mom was a librarian?
Yes, she was.
And did you spend much time in the library?
No, we didn't really. It wasn't a place like today where you might go and study. We'd just go there on Saturday, get the books, and come home. Because we lived in this village called Thornton, a small village. It's actually famous for one thing, the famous Bronte family.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah.
Charlotte, who wrote Jane Eyre, and
yes.
Emily wrote Wuthering Heights, and they were born in a house about a 10-minute walk from where I was born. I was one of those kids that was born at home, not in a hospital at that time. And so the village I grew up in is, if you've ever seen that show on PBS, All Creatures Great and Small.
Yes.
Or Downton Abbey even.
Yes. Beautiful.
That's the world I grew up in. Except in Downton Abbey, I'm from the family that was down in the kitchen.
Lucky you. What a better place to be at home.
So the library was a long walk, and we were out on like a little farm, really, in the countryside. And so you'd get the books, take them home, and that's where you'd read them.
I bet it was a beautiful place.
It was. I mean, as a kid, I lived there till I was almost 11. And, well, this might have been your life and many of our listeners' lives who are a little bit older, where your parents would turn you out in the morning and tell you to come home at dinner time, and
absolutely
nobody monitored you at all. You could have free reign of your imagination. So in some ways, it was a little bit lonely, my childhood, because we were far enough out of the village that there wasn't a lot of other kids around. I had an older sister and a younger sister, but it was the world of boys are boys and girls are girls, and I'd end up fighting with them because it was 2 against 1. And so I spent a lot of time alone, really. But with my imagination and all these kids shows on the radio, where you had to fill in the scenery, as it were, yourself. Or the books I read, these famous 5 books, were always going on adventures. So that's what I was doing with my childhood.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
And Ken, when did you first discover the joys of poetry, and what drew you to it?
Well, I think in that, I mean, this might take me a little bit to explain it, but in that time of being a kid, we had this field, and in the bottom corner of the field, which was in a valley overlooking a stream, it was really a lovely place where I grew up. And in this one corner of the field was a different type of grass that was very soft. And I would go down there in the summertime. I loved to lay in that grass in the afternoon and just watch the clouds come by. And you've probably done this as a kid, where you'd see shapes in the clouds there, and I think what I was involved in at that time was what I love. Joseph Campbell, the mythologist Joseph Campbell.
Yes,
and he talks about one of the first functions of mythology is to give you this sense of grateful, affirmative awe before the monstrous mystery that is existence. And I love that line of his, because that's what I felt like as a kid lying in that grass looking up at the sky. What is going on here? Why am I here? What's this all about? How can I sort of figure this out? In my childlike way, I mean, I'm articulating it as an adult, but I was just in front of this mystery. And I'm from a world that I think is best expressed by the poet William Blake. You know much about him. But, he was an English author and illustrator from the 19th century. And he illustrated this book called Europe with a beautiful illustration called The Ancient of Days. I don't know if you've ever seen this illustration.
No, I haven't.
And The Ancient of Days is really a representation of God from the book of Daniel. And it looks like an old father figure god with a compass in his hand up in the clouds dividing the earth up. And you see these beams of light coming down through the clouds from the sunlight. And when I would lay down in that grass at the bottom of the field where we lived, in the afternoon sometimes you'd get the sun breaking through the clouds with the shafts of light coming down. Often there was a storm coming or something like that, but it was very mystical for me, and so I was sort of captivated by that feeling, and it wasn't later till I found a way into understanding all that through poetry, but that was the kind of the beginnings of it, if you will. Mm-hmm. And my whole world there is like a William Blake poem, and he has this famous poem called Jerusalem, and he talks about the dark satanic mills in this poem called Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. People might know this poem because if you saw Chariots of Fire,
yes, that
movie, it's the theme from Chariots of Fire. Bring me my bow of burning gold, bring me my arrows of desire, bring me my spear, O clouds unfold, bring me my chariot of fire.
Beautiful.
That's part of the poem and they use that in the movie. And he talks about dark satanic mills, and where I grew up, it was full of those. The village I grew up in, every village around Bradford, which was the wool capital of the world back in the late 19th, early 20th century, was full of those dark satanic mills. I mean, I think Blake really his comment was aimed at the church because he was very anti-establishment, but he was surrounded by those mills also, so he used that as the metaphor. Mm-hmm. So that was the world I grew up in Industrial Revolution Victorian England, with these dark mills that were dark because of the pollution from coal-fired furnaces, and all the energy source at that time was coal.
Yes.
So you had the London fog was pollution, and all the kids had bronchitis growing up and all of that. Thank goodness we don't have to live in that kind of world anymore. We've got other problems. But
yes. No, absolutely. And Ken,
that kind of language of Blake is the language that I grew up in. Mm-hmm. The rhythms of the language itself, I think, led me to poetry eventually.
Is William Blake your favorite poet?
I have a lot of it, but I'd say he's a reference point for me. He's a starting point. Mm-hmm. He's my starting point because he's describing the world I grew up in, and so I can really relate to it. And he's not really like a conventional poet either. He's a bit odd. In fact, I know the famous poet William Wordsworth thought he was mad. They thought he was insane. He said, this guy's insane. So.
Oh, interesting. That's very interesting.
Something like that's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
And he has these lines that just, tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry, And there he's talking about what Campbell was talking about, this monstrous mystery that, what I always loved about Campbell was he says the first thing you realize about being alive is life eats life all the time, all around you. Out there on the farm, we'd get these wonderful little chickens. I'd go with my dad to the train station. We'd go and pick up a box of chickens, chicklets, little baby chickens, and bring them home. And a year later, with my grandfather, we were slitting their throats and eating them. So that's the life of the farm, So it's these two polarities working against each other all the time.
Interesting. And do you have a poet you'd like to read, either one that you have written yourself or one of your favorites?
I would, if you don't mind, because I grew up in Bradford, and this will give you a sense of how I feel about it. I have a poem called Bradford, which I would like to read. It's not very long. And it's, when I started to write poetry, I would start to work with these themes of waking up for the first time somewhere. And I'd write a poem about that, because I remember one time I went to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And I wrote a poem about waking up for the first time in Addis Ababa, because everything was different. The sounds, the rhythms, the light, you know. So I found myself always leaving Bradford, where I grew up, over the years. And so this poem is about leaving Bradford one more time. I wrote it in 2007, and it's just called Bradford. I'll read it now, if that's okay.
Go right. Be our pleasure.
A blood-red sky bursts through the blackness, and monolithic smokestacks rise out of this restless awakening. Coke-fired clouds float against the city lights, twinkling as burning cinders in a coal black morning. We round the rim of this post-industrial memory, driving down cobbled streets past silent mills and empty faces, shoddy remnants of a forgotten world, struggling for a future already lost in its warped west past. I want to make it whole again, but the cold mechanics of this place hides another intention, not unlike its beginning. I was formed in this crucible and dreamed my way out many years ago, but that blood-red morning warmed some part of my soul today, and like sandstone hewn from quarried earth, I am reworked one more time. Bradford, the fiery bowl of my beginning, spews me out of its ash-grey morning, as some blast-furnace phoenix rising on the dawn of a future 10,000 miles away.
Wow, that's beautiful, Ken.
So that's sort of how I feel about Bradford. You know, Bradford was the Amazon Jeff Bezos of now, back in the 19th century. All those industrial barons there that created those mills were like the Bill Gates and the Jeff Bezos of today. And then all that disappeared over time, and it became a forgotten world, and the mills went empty, you know, and the faces went empty also, so for a long time. And I think that's true of many parts of our country here. Over time, that happens as it's really driven by technology, if we think about it like that, you know.
Definitely.
And so we've got to learn to not get stuck there. You have to growing adaptation, I think, is the way forward for us, you know, into the future.
Yes.
That's why I love California. When I got here, I felt I was in the future. I always felt living.
No,
I'm in the future here. You know, it's such an exciting place to live that I was happy to arrive here.
Yes, I believe that too, Ken. I think most people who live in California know that. Yeah. Beautiful. And Ken, what inspires you when you write a poem?
Well, really what I'm looking for, the poems I like and the poets, it's not so much the poets I like, because honestly, I'm going to do a disservice to all the poets now, but I can pick a poetry book up, and sometimes I annoy my wife with this, because she'll just hear me flipping through the pages, you know, one after another. Because I can tell almost instantly when I land on a poem, that's a poem I like. And it's going to have a key in it. And that key is going to unlock something in my inner world that's going to lead me out of the mundane kind of everyday existence into something that goes back to that kind of monstrous mystery that Joseph Campbell talks about. It's putting me in that line, so to speak. And so that's what I'm looking for when I try to write a poem. Catch that thread. And here I could come back to William Blake again, I think, because he wrote this. I read you a bit of it earlier, this poem called Jerusalem, but he also wrote a book called Jerusalem. And in this book, he has a short section. It just goes like this. I give you the end of a golden string. You may wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate built in Jerusalem's wall.
Beautiful.
And the famous American poet, William Stafford, I don't know if you're familiar with him.
I'm not.
But, he's a famous, and he was really famous. He was a pacifist during the Second World War, which I think was not an easy thing to be in that time. And he was a professor at a college up in the Seattle area, I think. But he wrote a poem called The Way It Is, which is based on this particular piece of William Blake's book called Jerusalem. And I'll just read you this if you don't mind. Then
No,
I think it'll
go right
explain
ahead.
why the way I write poetry and why I'm interested in it. So, and if you just keep in sort of the back of your mind this idea of William Blake, he said, "There's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you are pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it's hard for others to see. While you hold on to it, you can't get lost. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you do can stop time's unfolding. You don't ever let go of the thread."
That's beautiful.
So I'm looking for that thread in the poems I love. They have that thread, you know, and in my own writing, I'm always trying to catch that thread. It can be a line that I run across that comes at me, and then I'm following the thread. And what William Stafford said was, you can't hold that thread too tight. If you hold it too tight, you'll break it. Which for me is you can't possess it. You know, you cannot possess the thread. You've got to work with it. But if you follow it, it will lead you. And you don't need anybody else to tell you what it is or the way it is. You're going to discover that yourself if you trust your inner world. But in order to trust that inner world, you have to develop it and discover it and find it. And that really was why I got interested in poetry, because poetry is so synthetic. It goes right there very quickly. And if you have ever written a poem or performed a poem, you cannot hide behind a poem. You know, you're out there on the ledge, so to speak. You know, you're exposed. You cannot hide behind it, and that's what I love about poetry. It deals with essences, with the essence of who the poet is, what the poem is, who you are, and what this mystery is that we find ourselves in. You know, we're all landed in some moment in history, in some place. We have a language we didn't choose. Before we can even talk about any of this, we absorb a language. We had no choice in any of that. It's accidental, completely accidental. But here we are. So what are we going to do with it? and what are we going to move towards, I would say.
Yes, holding on to that thread.
Yes, and that's what got me interested in poetry, really.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. We have to take a quick break, Ken. Will you stick with us, and
sure.
We'll be right back. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was Grammy Award-winning composer, musician, performing his Piccola Musica Nocturna from his new CD titled In the Wee Small Hours. His name is Carlos Franzetti, and he will be my guest on Pieces of Peace on Thursday, February 10th. My very special guest this morning is Mr. Ken Dickinson, and he is a longtime resident here in Marin County and ran a monthly open mic poetry night in downtown San Rafael called West End Wednesdays. Ken, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Susan.
For all our listeners, you are listening to Pieces of Peace here on KWMR. And, Ken, there's a very exciting event coming up in February. Would you like to tell our listeners about it?
Yes. Well, over the pandemic, like most of us, we found ourselves at home with time on our hands. So I realized I had all these photographs in my iPhone, which I've taken over the years. And I had this idea that perhaps I could set some of the photographs to some poetry or poems. A couple of poems that I already had, and some new ones that it sort of encouraged me to write. And when I used to run that West End Wednesdays open mic poetry, which ran for about 10 years in downtown San Rafael, it's right across from the Rafael Theater, and right across from the West End Cafe, which is now the Grapevine, by the way, which is it's a great place to eat. It's the Aroma Café, and always after the poetry event, because the West End Cafe closed down, we'd go over to the Aroma Café and have the after party there, so to speak. And always they had an exhibit down they have a very long wall in there, and they would always have an art exhibit there. One of the owners there, Vincent Latour, who's a wonderful guy, is very interested in supporting local artists and the whole community, really. His cafe is about that. And so they've always had art displays down there, photographic artwork that people put up. And so I was in there, and I thought, gee, I'm going to ask, how do you get to put your artwork up here? So I just, went up to the counter, and Vincent wasn't there, but his partner, he's a co-owner with, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, it's Roger Masbar is his partner. They've run this cafe for years. And he said, just give me your name, phone number, and email, and I'll pass it on to Vincent, and he'll contact you. And he did. I mean, I was surprised that he did, but he did. And I sent him some examples of what I wanted to do. And so he said, okay, great, you get the gray wall for February, March, and April. And so that is going to be an exhibit there for 3 months of my some of my photography and also some digital art that I created. And each one will be accompanied by a poem. And so that's coming up at the beginning of February. And actually, I'm going to have an open house there. And originally, I thought it was going to be the 5th of February, but I had to move it back a week. So it's going to be, I think, the 12th of February, Saturday. I think that's the 12th. Let me just check my calendar back. Yes, the 12th of February, from 2 to 6 will be an open house there. But if you go to the Aroma Café, and I hope all your listeners, I'm sure many people know it already. It's a wonderful place to go and hang out, meet friends. You know, it's got a great patio outside, so I think there's a lot of room inside. High ceilings. It feels like a really safe place to be, and I always receive a warm welcome there.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, I think I've told you this is my favorite place in San Rafael, and has been for a long time.
Yes.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I, as I mentioned in the introduction, you are a very talented photographer. Ken, before we go, would you like to tell our listeners your blog, how they can actually go online and see some of your amazing work and read some of your absolutely outstanding poetry?
Yes, I have a website, and I think it's fairly easy to remember. It's Poetic Opening, all one word, poeticopening.blogspot.com. And if you go to that website address, you'll see most of the things that will be actually up on the wall there, and the portrait, and a few others that won't. But if somebody wants to sort of check out what I'm writing about and so on, that
beautiful,
you can find it there.
Has some wonderful.
I do have to say though that I wouldn't really say I was a great. I mean, I think the iPhone is a great photographer, and I just push the button, if you like. So all my photographs are taken using my iPhone. And, well, it's the world we live in. You know, we're in a world of pushing buttons now. And so I'm grateful for that because, so I'm just pointing it really, but it's the phone that's doing all the work.
Mm-hmm. And Ken, tell us about the inner look technique.
Yes, well, I have to just go around the houses a little bit to get to it, but, you know, I arrived here because I'm a reverse war bride. That's how I like to put it. My first wife was her name is Rosie. She's still my friend, a wonderful person. And she was a student teacher in England, and we met and fell in love and lived there for a while. But eventually she got tired of living in England, and so she brought me back to the U.S. And I have to say I came a little bit under protest, but I got here, right? And when I got here, I had no computer skills. I had no skills at all. So I went to computer school. I enrolled in a computer school and got a new set of skills. And then this was in the early 80s, and the Bay Area, San Francisco, it was the gold rush for computers at that time.
Yes, it was. You were way ahead of the crowd.
Yes. So after a while, she got tired of living back home in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is where we landed when I came from England, and we drove out west, you know, like a lot of people, and landed in the Bay Area. And I loved it here because it reminded me of home, really. It reminded me of Yorkshire. Mm-hmm. In fact, just as an aside here, the closest I can get to Yorkshire is West Marin. If West Marin had stone walls, I'd feel like I was back right where I grew up.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So I love that whole area out there. You know, it always makes me happy to go out to West Marin. And I know your station's out there, and all your wonderful listeners a lot of them are out there probably. So I'm a big fan of where you're from.
Beautiful.
And at that time, I was working at a computer company in Emeryville, and I had a coworker who was from Argentina, and this was in 1982, it was when the war between England and Argentina broke out over the Falkland Islands, if you remember that.
Yes, I remember
which
clearly.
People from Argentina call it the Malvinas. And I got friendly with this person from Argentina who lived nearby me, and we would carpool to work together. And we'd have these wonderful conversations along the lines of my Joseph Campbell theme that I was talking about earlier. And he told me about this Argentinian writer, philosopher called Silo. And I got very interested in this person. And he gave me one of his books, which was called The Internal Landscape. And the very first, when you open the book up, the very first thing is the question. Yes, your question. Here is my question. As life passes by, is it happiness or suffering that grows within you? Do not ask that I define these words. Answer according to what you feel. Mm-hmm. And that just, blew me away. Because it's very poetic. And the British don't talk about their feelings at all, usually. That's the thing we avoid. We avoid it growing up. So here was somebody not being intellectual about anything or not asking me to reason something out or understanding, just talk about how you feel. So that is how I found my way into Inner Look poetry. He wrote another book called The Inner Look, and that book really helps you figure out how to follow that thread I talked about earlier into your own internal world and really discover who you are. And this was another thing I liked about Joseph Campbell. He said, the first function of mythology is to understand this mystery. And one of the other functions is you have to learn how to navigate the turbulent seas of your internal world. Mm-hmm. And how do you kind of find a way to develop a center of gravity within yourself that can stand up to the cruelty of the world that you see all around you, and the violence of the world, and the contradictions of the world that constantly we're up against,
yes,
on a daily basis. So that is how what I like to call Inner Look poetry. Most of the poems I write are trying to go to that place that's not any of this. Mm-hmm. For want of a better word, I would call it the profound. There is a profound part of ourselves that we're often disconnected from, or we, in the traditional world of contemporary modern life, you're allowed to visit that world on Sundays. This was the old tradition. I think it's changing now, but you can go there and visit that world on Sunday and then come home and get back to it, get on with it, as my mother would say. Her famous line was, when I told her all my profound thoughts and sayings in her very Yorkshire way, she said, well then, you'd better get on with it.
Very British.
That's very Yorkshire, where I'm from.
I love it. It's beautiful.
You can talk all your life, but in the end, you better do something about it. Otherwise, it's just talk.
Yes, that's so true. Oh my goodness.
So that's how I caught that thread of Silo and his writings and message, and he helped me develop. I mean, really, there's all these parks around the world that he sort of helped create. And I visited one in 2006, and I walked into one of the halls there, and there was this poetry session going on. And I didn't understand any of it because it was in Spanish, but it drew me in because of the sound and the rhythms and the emotion coming through was just so compelling and captivating. I couldn't walk away from it. And I met my really poetic mentor there, a friend, Isaias Nobel, and he really was the one that got me started writing poetry. He was the one that insisted not only that I write, that I send it to him and continued to write. And he gave me the idea to start that open mic poetry. And in fact, he had the idea to do this tour. We did a tour in 2008. We got an old bus, one of those shuttle buses that, you know, take people to the airport.
Yes.
And we covered it in poems.
Oh, how wonderful.
Covered in poems. And we did this tour from San Diego all the way up to Red Bluff, because there is a CeeLo Park up in Red Bluff, up near Redding, up in Northern California. So we took 1 month. We went on the road with this bus, stopping in different towns and cities along the way, doing poetry events, open events that anybody could come to.
Beautiful.
And, so he was really the one that got me seriously writing, and using the poetic opening. In fact, he came up with that phrase, the poetic opening, you know, that the poetry will open some part of you up to this mystery that we're in and help you figure it out and understand it. And then you begin to discover not just the poets, but the actual poems that will do it. Some poets have a few poems that will do it. Some that we know of, you know, like Rumi and Hafiz, and they are poets that can do it all the time, you would say. They've dedicated themselves to doing that. I'm sort of a bit in the middle, I guess. You know, sometimes I can do it, sometimes I don't feel I totally achieved it. But
do you ever think about doing a poetry tour again like that? I think that is absolutely wonderful that you did that.
Well, I have a funny anecdote here. Yes, maybe that moment passed, but now I'm down to exhibits, you know, where I don't have to get in a bus and go on the road for a month. The funny story is, after we'd finished the tour, there's the bus parked in our drive, and my wife Janet knew that it was slowly going to crumble into the driveway. You know, the tires were going to go flat. And so she arranged an exit for it without really letting me know till the deal was done.
That's great.
She got rid of it too. Our son worked for a barbecue company, and one of the guys he worked with ran an AA meeting, and he always had his eye on the bus. He said, if you don't need that bus, I could really use it for my AA meeting, you know, to transport the people around. And then in one moment, there he was, driving the bus away.
Oh, that's great.
So,
that's great. You willed it to a very needy source, so that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Ken, what best advice can you give others who now write or want to begin writing poetry?
Well, you have to start somewhere, you know, so you have to find, I think, poems you like. I don't know if you know the poet Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet.
No.
He's a wonderful poet, and I think he won even the Nobel Prize for Literature in the 90s. And he always talked about you've got to find your own voice. You've got to get a feeling in your own words for what you want to say. But the way you can start is find people that you admire, you know, that you say, gee, I could write that, or I wish I wrote that, right? So I think that's a wonderful way to get into poetry. And one of the things to do is go to a bookstore and ask for the poetry section, and then just start flipping through the pages, and you'll find something you like there. My favorite all-time bookstore for poetry is City Lights Bookstore in in San Francisco.
Yes.
If you've ever been there, and I always make a pilgrimage there once a year. I get on the ferry, and it feels like I'm going to Mecca or something, you know.
Sure.
That feeling about it, because they have a poetry room there, one entire room, and the sign that's up there says, "Why don't you sit down?" They have chairs up there. Sit down and read a book. They don't even ask you to buy a book there. They just say, "Sit down and read a book." But also the library, going back to my childhood and my mother, all libraries have great, great collections of poetry that those books need to get out in the fresh air once in a while, you know, and have somebody thumb through their pages. So I think and then just find a style. My style has the rhythms of William Blake in it, and where I grew up, you know, that language, the rhymes, the way the language works, I find I seem to write in that style often. And I know nothing about the structure of poetry. If you ask me what an Obad is or a gazelle, you know, my head starts spinning around in confusion. I know nothing about the formal writing, really, of anything. I just know what I like, you could say.
I personally like that myself, because it's a little more heart than head.
Yes, right. For me, it's completely heart, really.
Yes, beautiful. Ken, I wanted to mention very quickly, we only have a few minutes, but along with your artistic talents of poetry writing, photography, digital arts, and again, Ken, would you give our listeners your website so they can actually learn more about your wonderful talents?
It's Poetic Opening, all one word, .blogspot.com.
And also the Aroma Café, your photography will be exhibited there February, March, April, and
correct.
The reception is when now?
It's the February the 12th from 2 to 6.
And that's a Saturday, so.
That's a Saturday, yes.
Wonderful.
And it's kind of open, you know, I'll be there the whole time. There's no formal presentations, just a meet and greet kind of thing.
Beautiful.
Mainly because of the COVID, you know, we don't want to have a big crowd of people there all at once.
Beautiful. And what I wanted to say very quickly was, and this blows me away because it's like you are so right, left brain. You know, again, starting with the whole computer scene like in 1980. But along with all your artistic talents, you also train people on computers and actually have your own business in San Rafael called Bay Area Computer Training, and you are working with women right now. Yes,
I teach the YWCA, not to be confused with the YMCA. The YWCA, Women Over 50 training program, computer training program. This is for women over 50 who perhaps have found themselves, for various reasons, you know, in a moment in time when they have to go back to work, they have to look for a job, and a lot of the computer skills pass them by for various reasons. And so I've worked there probably for 3 or 4 years now to help those wonderful women gain the confidence and skills to work on the computer again.
That's wonderful. And that's what a wonderful endeavor, Ken.
Yeah, and you could just, if anybody's interested, they could just Google YWCA Marin, and you'll find out all the information there.
Great. And we have like 1 more minute, but would you like to give any more advice or any parting words to our listeners this morning?
Just follow the thread of your life.
Yes.
You know, if you can catch it. I call it the golden thread or the golden string, and start winding it, you know, and trust yourself, your intuition, who you are, your feelings. You know everything already, but don't pull it too tight. Don't try to possess it. and it'll lead you into Heaven's Gate, as William Blake said.
Wonderful.
I believe that.
I believe that too, Ken, and it has just been a complete pleasure having you as a special guest. And one of these days, I'd like to have you back to read some more of your terrific poetry.
Yeah, I'd love to do that, Susan. Could I just thank you and that wonderful station out there and all your listeners, wherever they are. I know they're not just in Marin, so
sure.
For supporting public radio, it's so important. And I'm supporting your station. I mean, I'm going to put my money where my mouth is, I would say, in my Yorkshire way,
Beautiful. Beautiful.
My mother would say, you better put your money where your mouth is before you say any more.
You had a great mom. Or as the English would say, mum.
Yes.
I love it.
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much, Ken. And hopefully I'll be seeing you soon. And I definitely will be at the Aroma Café on February 12th. And to see some of your wonderful photography and hopefully maybe hear some of your amazing poetry. Ken Dickinson, thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It's a pleasure. Absolute delight.
Same here. Bye now.
Bye.
My very special guest was Ken Dickinson, longtime resident of Marin County, and he's a poet extraordinaire. Thank you, listeners, for joining me this morning here on Pieces of Peace. And remember that an enemy is one whose story we have not heard. Have a beautiful day.